Today we're going to look at ecology. And ecology is all about the study of the interactions between living and non-living things. This includes relationships that range from an individual organism to the entire biosphere. An organism is a single living thing, whereas a population is a group of organisms of the same species that live together. A community, a group of populations that live together. An ecosystem, communities and their physical environments. Biome, a group of ecosystems that have the same climate, and a biosphere are all the biomes on Earth, so all the living areas of the planet. A single living thing, as an organism, an example would be us. We are organisms. A small nuclear family would be a group of organisms in the same species that live together. And then a community, a good example would be a college. A college community is a group of populations that live together. Ecosystems would be that college community plus their physical environment. Things like the buildings or the weather in that particular area. A biome is a group of ecosystems that have the same climate. And a biosphere, again, that's all of the ecosystems within each biome on Earth. Subgroups of ecology do exist, from the narrowest to the broadest, like population ecology, which is the study of how populations grow, or community ecology, the study of how populations interact with each other. What about ecosystem ecology? That's the study of how populations interact with their physical environment. And last but not least, there's also conservation ecology, which is the study of how to preserve and create a healthy, lasting biosphere. So let's ask ourselves some questions. Let's look at these levels of organization. We want to match the terms on the left with the definitions on the right. In population ecology, that would match with the study of group growth, whereas a biome would match with areas of the same climate. And a tundra is an example of a biome. So make sure you're familiar with these levels of organization. Here's some more terminology. I mentioned species when we were looking at organisms and population. That's a unit of one or more populations of individuals that can reproduce under normal conditions. And therefore they produce fertile offspring that can then go on and produce their own fertile offspring. So they are technically reproductively isolated from other such units. A species is specific to a certain type of population of individuals. Biotic factors is any living part of an environment, from plants to animals, whereas an abiotic factor, that's the non-living physical and chemical conditions affecting organisms, things like the weather, whether there's sunlight, water or precipitation, what is the temperature outside, soil, wind, natural disturbances. These are all examples of abiotic factors. Next, we're going to look at energy and life. And all organisms need energy to survive. We talked about this very briefly in Module 1, which stated almost all energy used in ecosystems comes from the sun. And autotrophic organisms can convert that light energy into chemical energy for themselves. A lot of autotrophic organisms are called producers because they produce their own energy. But there are also organisms that eat autotrophs or eat other organisms. These are organisms like carnivores or omnivores. And they're eating autotrophs or other organisms in order to gain energy. So energy conversion and flow is very important to ecosystems. They're driven by energy from sunlight. Remember, an ecosystem is just a level of ecological study. It includes all the organisms in a given area, along with factors with which they interact. So we're looking at abiotic and biotic features. So a community and its physical environment. And energy flow and chemical cycling are some of the two things we'll really be looking at, and they are interrelated processes that occur by transfer of substances or energy through the feeding levels of ecosystems called trophic levels. So speaking of that terminology, things like trophic levels or cycling in the environment, in order to look at energy flow, we have to consider feeding relationships and chemical cycles. Chemical cycle examples include the carbon cycle, water cycle, phosphorus cycle, and nitrogen cycle. But we'll start first with feeding relationships and look at the trophic levels. And one of the ways in which energy flows through an ecosystem is by feeding. Organisms eating other organisms, or autotrophs, and different living organisms eat each other. And the food is energy moving from one organism to the next. And one of the ways we do that is by looking at feeding relationships and corresponding trophic levels. And one of the ways in which energy flows through an ecosystem is by feeding. Different living organisms eat each other, and the food is energy moving from one organism to the next. So here are some definitions we want to go through. There are producers, organisms that produce their own food. We also know them as autotrophs, but they're being termed producers because they produce food for themselves and other creatures. There's also consumers. These are any organism that eat a living producer and or other consumers for food. This includes omnivores, herbivores, and carnivores. And they're consumers because they do not produce their own food source. They actually have to consume or eat producers in order to gain energy. A primary consumer is an organism that eats producers, like an herbivore. A secondary consumer is an organism that eats primary consumers, generally termed a carnivore. A tertiary consumer is an organism that eats secondary consumers. And a quaternary consumer is an organism that eats tertiary consumers. So it builds on itself. And then decomposers are organisms that break down the dead remains of other organisms. Examples include bacteria and fungi. So next we're going to be looking at food chains and how food chains show how organisms transfer energy by eating and being eaten. Notice that the arrows go in the direction of how energy is transferred. And we're going to start with the producer, and at the end of the food chain, we'll be at the top consumer, or carnivore. So look, here we're starting with grass. Grass is a producer. It's an autotroph. It produces its own energy. Then we move next to the cricket, a consumer that eats the grass. Next, we move to the frog, which is also a consumer, but above the cricket. And the frog eats the cricket. And last, we're at the top consumer, or carnivore, the raccoon, which eats the frog. So food chains are very sequential. But they can also be kind of simplistic. But here is another food chain. Sometimes they can cycle back on each other, especially if we include decomposers. So you can see here that we're starting with grass, the producer, which is eaten by a grasshopper, the primary consumer. The grasshopper is eaten by a secondary consumer, the bluebird, and the snake is the tertiary consumer, and it would eat the bluebird. Owls, an apex predator, is going to be most likely to eat the tertiary consumer. Another term for an apex predator is a quaternary consumer. But all organisms die and break down. In order to break them down, we need decomposers, something like a fungus, like here they're showing a mushroom. And the breakdown products from consumers end up in the soil and actually can help producers grow. So sometimes a food chain just doesn't quite cut it, and we want to be looking at a food web instead, because food chains are useful, but again, they can be a bit simplistic. For example, an owl actually is a quaternary consumer, but it could be a tertiary consumer. It was just as likely to eat that small bluebird. So it could be quaternary when it eats a snake, and tertiary when it eats a field mouse. And when any feeding relationship among organisms are interconnected this way, or could have multiple interconnections within an ecosystem, a more apt way to display and discuss such links would be with a food web, again, instead of a food chain. So something a little less sequential. That's because food webs link all the food chains in an ecosystem together. And each step or pathway of food transfer from one level to another in a food chain or a food web, that's called a trophic level. And each trophic level is the same number of steps from the sun's energy. Producers are only one level away, so they're the first trophic level. Herbivores, which eat producers, are 2 levels away from the sun, so that's the second trophic level. And then carnivores are found in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th trophic levels, depending on the type of consumer they are. So here we're looking at a food web, and notice the arrows are going multiple places. For example, a mouse is going to be eaten or could be eaten by a weasel, a hawk, or a raccoon. Raccoons also would eat grass, and mice eat grass. So we have a lot more interrelatedness here with a food web than we saw with a food chain. So a food web is a network or multiple food chains within an ecosystem. And if we look at the above food web, which of the organisms is the producer? And then which of the organisms above is the top consumer? So grass is going to be the producer, and the top consumer is the hawks, because they are the apex predator in a food chain. They would be the quaternary type of consumer. They're going to be at the very top because they can also consume the weasels and raccoons, which are kind of intermediary types of consumers. And the mice is much lower as an intermediary type of consumer than either the weasels or the raccoon. So when we think about trophic levels, we want to track energy as it moves through an ecosystem. Getting the most energy from the sun would be the producers, which take that sunlight or light energy and convert it into chemical energy. So we want to take a measure of the total amount of living tissue of an organism within a trophic level, and to do that, we take a term or measurement we call biomass. And producers, because they are the closest to the sun's energy, and they absorb it directly, they build biomass by absorbing that sunlight energy, processing it, and using it to make their own sugar or energy molecules. And so the maximum amount of energy available to all the trophic levels depends on the net primary productivity of the producers. Because if they have the most biomass, because they produce the most energy, because they're getting it directly from the sun, as we move up the trophic levels from the first to second, third, fourth, and so on, as we move up the levels, we're going to see less and less energy transfer. And that's generally because of primary productivity, which is the rate at which light energy is converted to the chemical energy of organic compounds, specifically by autotrophs in an ecosystem. And it's limited by a variety of factors that depend on specific ecosystems as well as changes in the season. But what we see is that primary productivity is not 100% efficient. It's usually only about 10% of the chemical energy available at one trophic level that appears in the next. A lot of that productivity, that energy, is going to be lost as heat. So not all of the energy that is in an organism, even when it's consumed, gets passed to the next trophic level. So here let's look at our trophic levels again. Producers in trophic level 1, going all the way up to our quaternary consumers in trophic level 5. You can see in trophic level 5, we have the hawk. In trophic level 4, a snake. A frog in trophic level 3, grasshopper in 2, and grass as a producer in 1. So if grass can create 10,000 kilocalories of energy by using sunlight, when the grasshopper eats the grass, it actually only gets about 1,000 kilocalories of that, so about 10%. And then when the frog eats the grasshopper, it only gets 100 kilocalories from that. The snake only 10, and the hawk only 1 kilocalorie. So tertiary and quaternary consumers must eat a lot more food to get the same energy amount that a producer gets. So the closer you are to the creation of energy directly from sunlight, like the producers, the more energy or kilocalories you get per unit volume. So let's quickly review the trophic levels. This is each step in a food chain or food web. In level 1, we have the producers, which are autotrophs. Level 2, primary consumers, which are herbivores because they eat producers. Omnivores and carnivores are in the secondary consumer level, and omnivores may eat other consumers or producers, and then carnivores only eat other consumers. A tertiary consumer is generally a top carnivore and will eat other secondary consumers and maybe also primary consumers. But if a quaternary consumer does exist in an ecosystem, they also eat the top carnivore, and they generally predate each other. So you'll see tertiary and quaternary consumers compete and have each other as food items in their diet. So let's also now take a look at ways of organizing this information. We'll look first at ecological pyramids. These are diagrams that show the relative amount of energy or the organisms contained within each trophic level of a food chain or web. So here is an ecological pyramid. Here we're looking at the amount of energy transfer from the producer level at the bottom, where we see 100% of the energy that's going to make it into a food chain or web, and how it reduces or decreases as we move up to that top trophic level, or the fourth or fifth consumer. And energy of tertiary and quaternary consumers is going to be less than those of producers, again, that are directly getting that energy from sunlight conversion into chemical energy. Here is another ecological pyramid, and it's showing you different types of organisms that are in each of these levels. It's showing you, for example, herbivores like the grasshopper, field mouse, and rabbit. And as energy moves through trophic levels, it's moving up away from the producers and the primary consumers. And we're eventually going to see that a lot of that energy is being lost. But where is it being lost to? Well, metabolic chemical reactions that take place as energy moves up the trophic levels, again, are not 100% efficient. So a lot of that energy loss is just as heat, especially as a waste product. And its metabolism, or the building and breakdown of products within a human body or other living organisms that are going to produce heat. And also some of that energy is lost as indigestible waste. So again, only about 10% of a trophic level stored energy is used for growth or the manufacturing of new biomass to power the higher trophic levels. And then anything left over at the end of food chains or food webs, decomposers are going to take care of that. And even though that energy that we think of as lost is not going to further or up the trophic scale, it can eventually be cycled back in either to the ecosystem or back into living things via decomposers. So our next topic is looking at other types of pyramids. So types of ecological pyramids include energy pyramids. And these are when organisms in a trophic level use the available energy for life processes, such as growth, photosynthesis, cellular respiration, metabolism, and again, they're releasing that as heat. So remember, every chemical process that happens in your body releases heat as a byproduct. Burning calories releases heat. And there's a rule of 10 when we're looking at energy pyramids. So remember, we're only going to see about a 10% transfer as we move up the trophic levels from producers to quaternary consumers. So here is another energy pyramid. And see, we start at 100% of energy that can get into producers or consumers at the bottom. As we move from the primary producers, which are autotrophs, up into the apex predators like quaternary consumers, we see a lot less energy available. So we actually have 10% only going to the primary consumers, 1 to secondary consumers. Third level consumers get 0.1%, and 0.01% if you're starting at 100% makes it to the apex predators, because a lot of that energy is lost as heat, or it's taken by the decomposers and eventually recycled back into the ecosystem and re-enters the energy pyramid, but at the bottom. And it's the primary producers that directly use the sun's energy to create their own energy molecules. That's why they're at 100%. Here's some other examples of pyramids that are ecological. We have an energy pyramid on the left and a biomass pyramid on the right. Notice with the energy pyramid, we're again looking at similar information, what organisms are in the pyramid, and how much energy, based on the block size, they're getting from the original 100% at the producer level. A biomass pyramid, on the other hand, is a pyramid that's representing the amount of living organic matter at each trophic level. So we would look, for example, at how many different types of producers are there? What different types of primary producer or consumer are there? What about when we go up into the secondary, tertiary, or quaternary levels for consumers? Are there more or less? We'll actually find that as we move up a biomass pyramid, we see less and less biomass. Because of the amount of energy that producers get, there are a lot more of them. There are less primary consumers, even less secondary or tertiary or especially quaternary consumers. And this biomass pyramid on the right demonstrates that. So energy and a biomass pyramid can also show up together. Notice that this pyramid on the left represents the amount of energy available at each level, as well as the amount of living tissue. So there's less amounts of tissue because there's less organisms in that tertiary consumer level compared to the primary consumer level or even the producers, but both decrease with each increasing trophic level. Both biomass and energy level decrease. So let's just briefly talk about each level. So trophic level organisms, let's start with the producer. Producers are the backbone of the trophic levels. Producers are autotrophs, they make their own energy from sunlight, and they oftentimes can perform photosynthesis, a process where you create chemical energy from sunlight. So that makes sense. Plants, algae, phytoplankton, especially phytoplankton, are responsible for this process of photosynthesis, which has a byproduct of producing oxygen. The next trophic level, consumers, includes herbivores, which eat plants only, like a cow, or carnivores, which eat animals only. An example would be a shark. Omnivores eat plants and animals, or omnivores, or mice, if you want another example. And decomposers break down dead, rotting materials, like bacteria and mushrooms, for example. So consumers are heterotrophs, which eat other organisms for energy, such as snails and pigs, and there are many trophic levels of consumers. So we can actually kind of look at these trophic levels in a food web. So we can return back to that type of organizational construct and notice here that producers, which are autotrophs, are consumed by herbivores, which are consumed by both carnivores and omnivores. Omnivores and carnivores and even herbivores create waste, and when they decompose, they have remains. And those things are broken down by strict decomposers or organisms that like to eat waste and remains, which are called detritivores. The consumers that we talked about here are all considered heterotrophs because they don't make their own energy, so it's not automatic like with autotrophs, a producer. So consumers are not autotrophs, they are heterotrophs. So energy flow through the trophic levels is also energy flow through ecosystems, and we can use these ecological pyramids because they work well for showing that decrease in the amount of energy that's being passed on to the next level. Remember, 90% of that energy before it goes on to the next level is being used by heat and metabolism in the previous organisms. So that's when we're seeing these energy decreases as you move through the trophic levels. And it takes a lot of vegetation to support the higher trophic levels. So we see more vegetation than we do primary consumers, more primary consumers than secondary, and so on and so on. More secondary consumers than tertiary consumers. And that can be represented by an energy and biomass type of pyramid. So here are just some strict definitions for the ecological pyramids. We looked at energy pyramids, which were, of course, pyramid shaped, and they showed the amount of energy or matter at each trophic level in an ecosystem. A biomass pyramid is just looking at how much dry mass or tissue of organisms that fit each trophic level is present in an ecosystem. And there's also pyramids of numbers. We haven't looked at them too much, but these are based on the number of individual organisms in each trophic level of an organism. So an energy pyramid is the one we've been looking at the most, using that rule of tens, seeing how much less energy goes up as we move into or towards the apex predators. A biomass pyramid, looking at, again, that dry mass, and it's providing data about information about how much biological matter exists in a certain region. So even though energy is lost as we move up in trophic levels, there are also fewer creatures. So we see a combination of less energy and less creatures as we move up in the trophic levels. And then a pyramid of numbers has a couple of disadvantages and also some advantages. It provides a lot of raw data. They're really simple, they're pretty easy to read, and it allows for great comparison, especially for population numbers at a particular time or a season each year. Some disadvantages: since they are more simplistic and we're looking more at the data, the numbers, definitely a type of quantitative data, all organisms are included regardless of size. So the primary producer or plant area at the bottom could be trees or it could be grass. It gives you no information about the environment. So the numbers don't represent diversity. Even though producers are generally the most abundant, there might just be one type of producer present in an ecosystem. And we have no idea how much diversity exists in an environment if we use a pyramid of numbers. Make sure to watch part 2. The next part of our ecology chapter is all about the biosphere. All right, now we're going to be looking at the biosphere. And the biosphere is the sum of all the Earth's ecosystems on land, in the air, in the water, and it's a closed system. So all the elements, the chemicals, other organic matter involved in ecosystems stays within the ecosystem with just a few exceptions. The exceptions are energy that enters the system as sunlight. So that is coming from an external area, so it's not 100% a part of this closed system. But it becomes a part of the system by being absorbed and utilized via producers. And energy that leaves the system as heat, that waste isn't always 100% incorporated back into the biosphere. Some escapes out into the atmosphere and then into space. So energy moves through an ecosystem in one direction, but things can escape or be incorporated like sunlight or something being lost like heat. But elements generally move in cycles, and this is because all matter is recycled within and between ecosystems of the biosphere. So we're going to look at cycles that replenish water, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, and also phosphorus. So we're going to look at those next. So this is another way in which energy flows through an ecosystem. We've been looking at trophic levels, different types of ecological pyramids, but now we're going to look at the chemical cycling of materials. And chemical materials are energy, and that moves as they cycle from one location to another. So here are the general steps of kind of basic chemical cycles. So we're going to have the producers take elements and chemicals from the abiotic environment, something like sunlight, for example, and they're going to incorporate that into themselves. They're going to turn that into from an inorganic compound into an organic compound. And then consumers are going to feed on the producers. So consumers are going to take some of that energy the producers made, some of those organic compounds, and take them for themselves, and they'll break down those organic compounds, incorporating some of them into their bodies, releasing some back into the environment as waste. So when an organism dies or decomposes, we break down organic molecules, and that returns some of these original chemicals to the environment, especially to be used again by the producers. So here's a quick overview of chemical cycles. So we're looking at various material circuits or cycles, and they involve both the nutrient and physical components of an ecosystem. We'll look at carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water, and they're all needed by each organism on Earth. Carbon especially is needed to build organic molecules. Nitrogen is needed for nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. Phosphorus is great or needed for energy molecules like adenosine triphosphate or ATP. And water is needed to maintain life. All chemical reactions have to happen in a watery environment. So how does every organism on Earth have access to these limited resources? That is through chemical cycling. So again, we're going to be focusing on the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and water cycle. Let's start with the carbon cycle. It's a key component for the generation of organic molecules. Organic molecules are found in living organisms. We have organic molecules within us, or you could say that we are made up of organic molecules. We're looking at the movement of carbon atoms from organic and inorganic molecules and how they move in the biosphere. That's what's called the carbon cycle. And it regulates the amount of carbon in ecosystems. It keeps track of carbon dioxide mainly, which is considered inorganic. And we'll see how carbon dioxide can be converted back into an organic molecule, something like glucose, which is C6H12O6. And these are different ways that carbon dioxide enters the air. Volcanoes. Volcanoes on land and in the ocean release carbon dioxide. Decomposing. The carbon in dead organisms is converted into carbon dioxide by decomposers. Burning, or a fire. When something burns, that oxidation reaction produces carbon dioxide, which is then released into the environment. And also living organisms breathe out carbon dioxide as a waste product or byproduct of cellular respiration. And there also are ways that carbon dioxide leaves the air. Carbon dioxide is utilized by plants in order to make sugar. So they utilize carbon dioxide, make sugar, and then they also release oxygen as a byproduct. And some carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean, and it's used to make shells or mineral deposits in aquatic life. So when we talk about the carbon cycle, we also have to talk about the greenhouse effect. And that's a process whereby certain gases usually water vapor, so evaporated H2O, CO2 or carbon dioxide, and methane, also CH4, they're going to trap heat that would otherwise escape the Earth and go out into space. So not all of those gases, not all of the water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane do make it into space. They get kind of hung up in the atmosphere and they trap heat that's also trying to get into space. So carbon dioxide itself has a very important task in keeping the Earth hospitable for life, or keeping it warm enough for us to live. So it helps keep the planet warm. This is the general process. So some solar radiation is reflected by the Earth and the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases like water vapor, methane, and nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide, they're able to capture or absorb some of this solar radiation or let it bounce off of them and re-emit it in all directions. And some of that re-emittance does go back towards the Earth. And the effect of that re-emittance again is solar energy warming the Earth's surface and the lower atmospheric levels. Next, let's look at the oxygen cycle. So most organisms are aerobic. That means we need oxygen in order to survive. We take in oxygen, perform a process called cellular respiration to produce energy, and a byproduct of that is carbon dioxide. Well, the physical processes that cause oxygen to be used up and replenished can be called the oxygen cycle. And these involve a lot of organisms, especially the aerobic ones. So the general process is oxygen gets used up by organisms. When they breathe, they take it in. And then natural and human-made fires also use up oxygen. There's also the formation of rust. That's an oxygen-using process. And some oxygen is converted into ozone by the energy of the sun. So we have numerous processes that are utilizing or taking in oxygen, burning it up, using it to make something new, or doing a chemical reaction or change. And these processes don't always re-emit the oxygen in the same capacity. For example, oxygen that is used up by aerobic organisms during the process of cellular respiration is converted into different chemicals. Some of it ends up in CO2 or carbon dioxide, which then is released or breathed out. So the amount of oxygen in the air does not change as it's used up, but that's only because there are other processes which also restore it to the air. So not only are there processes like cellular respiration or us breathing it in to make energy that use up oxygen, there's others that let it go back out into the atmosphere. And the main one is photosynthesis. That's a major process performed by autotrophs or producers in which they take sunlight or light energy and convert that into chemical energy. And they're going to utilize CO2 or carbon dioxide to do this, but a byproduct of this process of photosynthesis is the creation of oxygen. So green plants on land, phytoplankton in the water, they can perform photosynthesis. And photosynthetic organisms convert carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Those are the reactants they convert using sunlight into sugar and oxygen. So oxygen is a product of photosynthesis. And plants therefore release this oxygen into the atmosphere. We also see that the amount of water in the air is regulated by the water cycle. And we'll talk more about that. And the amount of carbon is regulated by the carbon cycle, which we've talked about. So carbon, water, and oxygen cycles are not completely isolated from each other. They deal with each other, they interact, products of one are reactants of the other. So notice not all cycling or chemical processing in the biosphere is unrelated or is by itself. So let's look a little bit more at the carbon cycle. We know it reflects the connected processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. For example, we turn inorganic carbon dioxide into organic glucose, or C6H12O6, during the process of photosynthesis. So the utilization of carbon dioxide in the carbon cycle produces oxygen in photosynthesis, and that last part is part of the oxygen cycle. We also need water in living organisms, like plants and us, in order for these chemical processes to take place. So both photosynthesis and cellular respiration rely on the carbon cycle, the water cycle, and the oxygen cycle. So since photosynthesis generates oxygen, the oxygen cycle is generally coupled with the carbon cycle. And then we also generally acknowledge that the water cycle plays a role. So here's a basic overview of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So we have light energy from sunlight hitting an organelle in plants called a chloroplast. This is where we have the stuff that absorbs light in plants, and this helps initiate the process of photosynthesis. So we get light energy converted into chemical energy via photosynthesis. That also turns carbon dioxide and water into organic molecules like sugar and oxygen. So CO2 is considered inorganic. Glucose or sugar is considered organic. So we convert inorganic to organic during photosynthesis. And carbon is utilized in this process. We also take these organic molecules and break them down in a process called cellular respiration. And plants can do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration, where something like humans can only perform cellular respiration. So something like a human, we have cells that contain organelles called mitochondria. These perform cellular respiration to create ATP, or energy. And the byproducts of this are CO2 and H2O. So in the carbon cycle, carbon leaves the air in photosynthesis and returns in an organic molecule. We're getting oxygen returned to the environment via the oxygen cycle, via photosynthesis. But the same reactants are products in one reaction, and vice versa in the other reaction. So notice how light energy eventually is able to power most cellular work via the processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration, but this isn't 100% efficient, so even though energy or ATP is created, heat energy is a byproduct. So here are just some of the ways we can get CO2 in the atmosphere for review. Burning, so oxidation reactions. As a byproduct of cellular respiration, so plants and animals breathe out CO2, or let go of CO2 as they perform cellular respiration. Any plants that perform photosynthesis, though, also release oxygen. This includes not only something like a tree or grass, but algae and phytoplankton or cyanobacteria. And then other organisms break down dead or decaying matter, and they can return CO2 from that breakdown process into the environment. So next we're going to be looking at the nitrogen cycle, and nitrogen is in many of the chemicals that make life possible, such as DNA and RNA. We also specifically find it in proteins. So the majority of the air that we breathe is actually made up of nitrogen, not mainly oxygen. 78% of the air we breathe, atmospheric air, is nitrogen. And nitrogen gas exists as a diatomic molecule, or N2, in nature, and it's not very reactive. As a result, organisms have to use nitrates, nitrites, ammonia ions, or ammonia ions for the biosynthesis of organic substances that contain nitrogen. So essentially N2, or nitrogen gas, must be converted into these nitrates and nitrites and ammonia or ammonium, because otherwise living organisms can't use them. So nitrates are chemicals that contain NO minus 3 ions, or you would say contain nitrate ions. Nitrites are chemicals containing NO2 with just a minus ions, or you could just say nitrite ions. And then ammonia ions are NH3, and ammonium ions are NH4 with a negative. So this process of turning nitrogen gas into something that can actually be used is called a nitrogen fixing. And most nitrogen fixing is done by nitrogen fixing bacteria, like rhizobia. They have been designed to take nitrogen gas from the air and combine it with hydrogen in order to convert it to ammonia and ammonium ions. This process of converting nitrogen gas into an ammonium type of ion is called ammonification. Again, rhizobia is an example of this nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and they generally form a symbiotic relationship with plants. They hang out on the roots, and symbiosis is just a close relationship between two or more species, where at least one benefits. And plants are using the ammonia and ammonium ions, and the rest is turned into nitrites and nitrates by other types of bacteria called nitrifying bacteria. Once made, the reactive nitrogen molecules are absorbed by producers and then travel up the food chain when consumers eat producers. So we need nitrogen-fixing bacteria in order to change nitrogen gas into something usable for living organisms. Otherwise, it can't move up the trophic levels. So since certain prokaryotes or types of bacteria fix nitrogen in the atmosphere into ammonia, plants are able to use that. Then they fix the rest into nitrites and nitrates, which living organisms further up the trophic levels can use. So plants are absorbing the ammonia and nitrates, and then they convert the rest into different types of essentially nitrogen molecules that proteins can incorporate into themselves, and that's what travels up the food chain. And then once an organism breaks down or dies, detritivores or decomposers reduce dead plants, animals, and their products into the ammonia components again, and that can be reused by plants or deposited in the soil. So nitrogen in the soil is returned to the atmosphere in the form of free nitrogen by denitrifying bacteria for prokaryotes to fix again. So we have this cycle of nitrogen being fixed, then utilized in plants, then slightly modified and put in proteins. Then those organisms that use or need the proteins are broken down, and we take that nitrogen byproduct from broken down organisms, put it back in the atmosphere, and then it eventually makes it into plants again and is fixed via the nitrogen fixing bacteria. So here we can see nitrogen cycling in the atmosphere. So plants are able to fix nitrogen, and then organisms eat the plants, and they incorporate that nitrogen into their proteins. And when this organism breaks down, decomposers using aerobic and anaerobic types of processes are able to essentially break down that nitrogen fixated form of nitrogen and put it back in the atmosphere. But nitrogen types of bacteria are able to, once it's back in the atmosphere, fix that nitrogen in the atmosphere back into plants. So it's a repeating cycle. Next, let's look at the phosphorus cycle. So it is a cycle, so we could begin anywhere. But let's just start with phosphorus from rocks leaks into the soil by sediment runoff. That runoff is phosphorus rich, and it gets added to the soil as phosphate. And the phosphate in the soil is absorbed by plants. Animals eat the plants. The animals that eat the plants that contain phosphate eventually excrete feces, or decomposers break down the animals that contain the phosphate because they ate the plants, and that is going to end up in runoff that goes to the oceans. The ocean deposited phosphorus ends up on rocks, as for example tides come in and out, and then the sunlight kind of bakes it into the rocks, and that's how we get phosphorus in rocks, and it's available to then leak off into the soil and start the process over again. So here we can see that phosphorus cycling process. So we get precipitation, which washes the phosphorus off. This is runoff that goes into bodies of water, like the ocean. The phosphate in solution generally settles down into new rocks at the bottom. And this is used or taken up via geological uplifting, or you might think of it just as evaporation. And it ends up back in the rain, and then again we're looking at runoff. We also get some of this rain that contains phosphorus that ends up on rocks being deposited on plants, which absorb that. And when plants absorb a certain chemical, organisms that eat that plant also take in that chemical. When those plants or animals break down, decomposers can also break down and release phosphate or excess chemicals into the soil. And that's how you get phosphate in the soil, both from runoff and leaching from decomposed organisms. And finally, we've made it to the water cycle. And water is one of the most important organic compounds on Earth. All organisms on Earth need water to live. Water has tons of chemical processes that we've looked at, things like the ability to form hydrogen bonds, the ability to adhere, form cohesion. We looked at capillary action. But water is also a very important solvent. And in being a solvent, it allows for chemical reactions to take place within it. So as a result, water is vital to all ecosystems, all living things. It's also a recyclable resource. All living things use water, yet it does not ever get used up. Again, that's because it's cycled. So water cycles from oceans, lakes, streams, back up into the atmosphere via evaporation, down to the ground via precipitation, and even back to surface waters again via runoff. Evaporation allows water to leave the surface of the earth and move into the air. So during the day, water warms the air, or water vapor, and that causes the moist air to rise even higher in the atmosphere. And then as the air rises higher, in the atmosphere, it cools. And as water vapor cools, it begins to condense or form something a lot closer to liquid water. And this forms clouds in the high levels of the atmosphere. And as the cooled off condensation accumulates in these clouds, eventually liquid water forms and precipitation occurs, or raining. Precipitation brings water back to the surface of the earth, and some water returns to oceans or other bodies of water, whereas some water falls on land, and that is absorbed by plants, or even the soil. And when water evaporates from the leaves of a plant, it's actually called transpiration. So we have tons of different names for the cycling of water and the certain processes within it. And that transpiration allows for water that was on land to go back up into the air. So water that falls on land can return to bodies of water. Water that falls on plants can be evaporated, also return to the air. Runoff can occur and make water go back into large bodies of water from land. And even water can be absorbed by the soil and added to a groundwater supply. So here is the basic water cycle. Let's start with rain. So rain is precipitation, and it's water falling to the earth. Water can land in oceans or land. It gets absorbed by the soil if it lands on land or by plants. Some runs off back into oceans or is used by living organisms, and when they're broken down, you might get some of the water in their living bodies that are now decaying going to the groundwater. But after that happens, water from the ocean can evaporate back into the air and then eventually condense into clouds, and then finally, again, precipitate and rain down water on the earth. So here are just some examples of ways that water is cycled. So we can get evaporation from the sea. Eventually that will condensate and fall back down as precipitation. That precipitation can occur over the ocean or bodies of water or land. Evaporation can also happen, including transpiration as sources of evaporation over land. And there can be a net movement of water if we're looking at different types of wind speeds or weather that allows for these clouds that are forming and condensating water in the atmosphere. And then some of the runoff or bodies of water will produce runoff, and it will go down into the soil and eventually make it into groundwater. So let's look at some questions. Let's look at the chemical cycles, and let's first look at which cycle has a chemical which becomes deposited on rock. The phosphorus cycle. How about which cycle provides the basis of organic molecules? That's the carbon cycle. So organic molecules arise during the process of photosynthesis when inorganic carbon dioxide gets turned into organic glucose, which is C6H12O6. What about which cycle requires the help of bacteria? That would be the nitrogen cycle with our nitrogen-fixing bacteria like rhizobia that forms a symbiotic relationship at the roots of a lot of plants. So let's just review what you've learned before we go forward. Well, ecology is the study of interactions between organisms and environments. We looked at chemical cycles and how they circulate raw materials like water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. We looked at energy flow and trophic levels. We looked at how the earth circulates energy to support life, how it begins with sunlight. We looked at two types of energy flow. We looked at feeding relationships first, and then the chemical cycles. And we also looked at how ecology can be studied at different levels. There's different subdisciplines. We can look at the organismal level, or population level, or even community, ecosystem, biome, or even biosphere level. And we looked at feeding relationships, and that is how we see circulation of energy from the sun to the producers up to the tertiary consumers, sometimes even quaternary. And that leads us to one of our last units, which is the ecosystems and biomes. So make sure to watch part 3.